spoke on the BYU campus probably before some of you were even born. I spoke at, I guess it's called Constitution Day, if I got the right place, in the Danny Ainge hall or building, which I remember very vividly because Danny Ainge, I come from Boston, and Boston has a basketball team. I'm not sure. And in fact, this year we're favored Boston Celtics in every win, and everybody attributes that to what Danny Ainge did before he left and came back to be the general manager, I guess, of the Jazz. So that's my effort to kind of ingratiate myself with you. I actually don't know Danny Ainge, but I watch him on television. And it's great for me to be here, and for Shannon and I both to have a chance to talk to you. What we would like to do, is share with you some of the empirical findings of this study called the Upswing. Why it's called the Upswing is a really important part of the story, and we'll explain that as we go. There are sort of two halves to this talk and book, one in which we try to describe what's happened recently, and one in which we try to figure out what lessons that has to fix the problems in America. And I want to begin there with the problems. We have the next slide. America is in what my mom would have called a real pickle. Is that a term? You understand what I mean? It's a technical, scientific term. America's in a pickle because in virtually every dimension of our society, by the way, if you want to back there, if you want to stand, that's fine, but there's plenty of room up here, and I promise you no one will look at you when you leave. So if you want to come up here, do. No. First of all, and some of this is not going to be surprising to you, some of it may be surprising, America is extremely polarized politically. And I'm going to show you some graphs and charts that illustrate data that are consistent with what I've said here. America is probably the most polarized politically than we have ever been in our entire national history, with the possible exception of the years between 1860 and 1865. You'll know what that means, and you'll know that means it's a close call even, actually. By some measures, we're more polarized than we were on the eve of the Civil War. So we're really, really polarized. Separately from that, it turns out that we're also very unequal economically. The gap between rich and poor in America is probably higher than it's ever been in American history. That's a long American history. In that whole period, the gap between rich folks and poor folks has hardly ever been as big as it is today. And separately from that, the degree to which we connect with one another, what sometimes I've called social capital, but it just means connections with our friends and family and neighbors and community institutions, that also is at an all-time low. And lastly, our sense of being in a collectivity, of being a we, we're all in this together, that is also at an all-time low. We're in a very, I would say, almost narcissistic period of our culture, focused on the self in many ways. And so now what I'm going to do now is the big question is, how do we get here? How do we get ourselves into this awful situation? And then the second question is, and Shannon's going to talk more about the second question, what do we do? What lessons can we learn from the history to help us? And we think there are very practical lessons that are applicable today, that you could walk out of here today and do to help turn this around. That's the bigger picture of the lecture. Okay, so far? So now I'm going to, we go to the next slide. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides. I'm a numbers person. If you're a numbers person, this is your time. If you're not a numbers person, that's okay too. Just close your eyes and settle back. And if I say something interesting, your neighbor will nudge you. And I know that many of you will have at least skimmed this book. Actually, this is not a test. I'm just trying to figure out audience familiarity. How many of you have opened the book called The Upswing? Okay, so roughly half of you have, and roughly half of you haven't. So I'm going to be trying mostly to speak to people who haven't, so you get some sense of what's in the book. And there are a lot of graphs and charts in the book, and this is the first one I'm going to show you. All the charts I'm going to show you are going to have the same format, so let's get adjusted to that right now. The horizontal axis is time. So this is 1880 and 1890 and 1900, da 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 da. Sort of, here's where I'm born, and this is when I'm in college, and this is when my kids were born, and this is when my grandchildren were born, and this is when they were in college, and my grandchildren, I have 7 grandchildren, and they're mostly now in their 20s and off making a living, and here we are in 2023. That's the horizontal axis. So as we move from here to that end, we're looking at the history of the last 125 years, roughly speaking. And the vertical axis is a measure of how well we're doing by any of these 4 areas: politics, economics, society, and culture. And up is always going to be sort of good. So in the case of political polarization, polarization is down, and because that's not good. And comedy, which is just our term for the opposite of polarization, is up. And you can see, therefore, that around the turn of the century, the last century, around 1900, America was very polarized. At that point, we were more polarized. We were slightly less polarized than we had been between 1860 and 65, but we were awfully polarized there. But you can see, beginning in the early years of the 20th century, we began to move and become a little less polarized. Still, in the big picture, still often polarized, but the trend was going in that direction. Does that make sense? I'm not going to spend any time with you telling you how we measured any of these variables, because this is it's not that kind of a class, although, believe me, I'd love to tell you, because I spent years and years working on all these numbers. And behind each of the charts I'm going to give you, there are 20 other charts that use 5 or 6 other measures of, in this case, polarization. So, just to illustrate, one measure of polarization is the degree to which people in the 2 parties in Washington vote either together or apart. If we're not very polarized, there are going to be lots of Republicans voting on one side and lots of Democrats voting on that same side, and lots of Republicans and Democrats voting on the other side. In party terms, lots of overlap between the 2 parties. Does that make sense? But you know that number now, the number of people, Democrats who vote on with the Republicans or Republicans with Democrats, is essentially 0. That is, polarization could not mathematically be any more extreme than we are now. That's just one of lots of other measures. Lots of other measures include how do ordinary citizens feel about people in the other party, and how about in local government, all that. Now you're going to just have to trust me, but I know this is a good audience, and you will trust people. And so, trust me. They all show the same pattern. And the pattern is high polarization. Remember, high polarization means low cooperation, low inter-party cooperation. Getting better and better, rising through the 20s and 30s and 40s, and you might think, well, people are cooperating because it's wartime, but no, we keep going, and in the 50s we're still going up, and even into the 60s, we're becoming more cooperative, and that's an era of, almost none of you will remember this, well, probably none of you will actually remember the fact, some of you have read the history, there was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower who was president in that period. He was the least partisan president in American history, other than George Washington. He didn't cause this. His election was a reflection of this. You see, we were very, but then suddenly, silently, mysteriously, as the years went on, that trend reversed. You can see it reversed there in the 70s and 80s and 90s, down, 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 down. The data in this book, because we had to stop collecting data and write our book, end in about 2015, but of course we've kept track of what's happening ever since, and now we're down here. The data, if I could actually put the data on the chart, we're now, that's what I meant when I said we're more polarized, way more polarized than we were then, and even we're about at the level of 1860 to 65. Does that big picture make sense? You understand, we were once very polarized, then we got more and more cooperative politically, lots of bipartisan collaboration, and then now we're back down in a very polarized state. You certainly knew that we were very polarized, but you may not have known how we got there. Now I want to show that I'm going to be quicker on the next slides because you have the basic idea. If we have the next slide, we're going to be looking at inequality. What's the next slide here? 25. Okay, well, we're not doing so bad. The problem is I love data, and I could spend hours trying to persuade you that the data is really exciting, but I know I won't. I'm not going to do that because we got to get on to the subjects. So here is the vertical axis, same horizontal axis. Vertical axis here is inequality or equality. Up is equality, down is inequality. This is what was called then the end of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, when there was a huge gap between the rich folks up on the Upper East Side of New York, all of whom had mansions and, in today's terms, billions and billions of dollars, and just 10 miles south of there on the Lower East Side of New York, there were a lot of the huddled masses who were impoverished. And that was the Gilded Age, big gap between rich and poor. And then, but here we are in the first years of the 20th century that we're already beginning to close the gap. In absolute terms, gap is still huge, but the trend is in the right direction. There's a pause here. That's the Roaring 20s, when the stock market took off and poor people didn't have jobs, and therefore there was a big raising. The trend reversed here. The trend of inequality reversed because of the Roaring 20s, but then now here, even before the Great Depression takes place, which is here, inequality goes up. Every year, you can see it there, every year, the rich people at the top are getting richer and richer, and the poor people at the bottom are getting poorer and poorer. And again, there are many different measures that we use for that. One is just the distribution of income, another is distribution of wealth, and before and after taxes, and how much chances there of mobility up for poor people to become rich. And so all of those graphs show exactly the same trend, getting more and more equal, rising up in the 40s, and then even in the 50s, and even into about 1960. And I want to give just a brief comparison. America in 1960 was almost the most equal country in the world. We were more equal than Sweden in the distribution of income. Think about that. It was astonishing how equal we were. And then things began to turn. 1960, and you can see gradually it goes down, 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 down. And this is the middle of the Obama years, and it looked like maybe the downtrend had ended, but actually, again, if we continue the numbers to now, it just goes sharply down, and part of that is patterns of public policy under the previous president, under President Trump, where the rich got tax cuts and the poor didn't. And then part of it is, of course, the pandemic, which also caused inequality to grow. We all know that part. You all know this part of the story. What you might not have realized is that's just the tail end. I mean, the growth in inequality has been going on, you can see it there, for 50 years. I mean, Trump was barely in grade school when this began, so it's not basically a story about Trump. It's a story about something deeper. Does that make sense? Then the advantage of getting these really long pictures is you can see some of the things that people would say about what causes polarization or inequality or whatever can't be true. It can't have any it may be that Trump, for example, was riding a little bit on the waves of this, but he wasn't causing these. They're much deeper historical waves. Let's have the next slide, which is social cohesion. This is a measure of the degree. Again, it's a measure of lots of different measures that all tell the same story: the degree to which people are involved in their community, the degree to which they join groups, the degree to which the degree to which their family is a big deal. In some periods, many people don't get married and they don't have kids, and in other periods, most people do get married and do have kids. It's a measure. Also in there are the measures of the degree to which people trust one another. So that's a measure of connectedness. It's what in some of my work have called social capital. And again, you can see the same basic picture. Maybe Sheila later on will tell you what it looked like back here, but this is a period in which there was a huge, Americans were very disconnected with one another. In that period, many, many people remained for the whole of their lives as either spinsters or bachelors. Those were the language. I recognize it seems like old-fashioned language, but lots of people never got married, ever got married. and didn't have kids. But then gradually, so it's, and back there, most people didn't trust other people, but then gradually, you see again here, beginning of the 20th century, that begins to change. Still low social cohesion, but it's going in the right direction. Again, this pause in the you know, a little bit of a plateau there in the 20s, but then going up here. And here in 1960, not only was there a high degree of involvement, for example, in PTA. Do you know what the PTA is? Parent-teacher organizations. Every year, the PTAs across America got hundreds of thousands. Each year, the increment was hundreds of thousands of people. And it seemed like it was going on forever. Everybody in America would be a member of the PTA. But then, suddenly, that stopped. For all sorts of organizations, PTAs and bowling leagues, that's a reference to a great book you ought to read. And then sort of sharply downwards, steadily downwards, and keeps going down. And you know what that looks like now. You probably know. You know that lots and lots of young people in America never get married. They're not in this room, but there are lots and lots of young people who will never get married and won't have kids. And it's just like it was back 125 years ago. You see I'm trying to make you feel what this chart is telling you by reference to the parts of the chart that you've experienced. Most of the people in the room have never experienced anything of this chart except like from here on. But you know what this looks like, and I'm trying to show you what it used to look like. Last, I'll be quick about this. I'm almost supposed to be done by now, all right? Yes? Okay. I'll be very brief. The last is a set of measures about the degree to which we feel culturally as if we're one. Do we feel like we want to connect with other people, or are we narcissistic, focused only on me? And if we have that slide, this is what that slide looks like. I wish I had time to talk you through it. Indeed, I wish I had time to explain the detailed measures here, because it's the one I'm most proud of as a scientist. But there it is, the graph. So let's put all those charts together. You see, and you already guessed this, we've looked separately at politics, economics, society, and culture, and we've seen these four different slides, but they're not four different slides. They're the same picture. You see what you should, as a statistical matter, your mind should be blown by now. How could it be that all of these features of American society were moving in rhythm? But they were. And so, since that's true, we can put them all in one single slide, and that's that. This slide summarizes to a remarkably accurate degree how America changed. Beginning over here, we were an I society, unequal, disconnected, fighting with each other politically, focused on the I. And over here, we were all very much connected, and we were equal, and we were politically cooperative, and we were culturally we thought of ourselves as a single country. But now, we're back like we were over there. In some respects, even worse by the time you get out to 2023, which is out here, even worse than we were there. More unequal, more polarized, more socially isolated, epidemic of loneliness sweeping the country. I'm trying to echo the things you've heard about in public commentary now about the epidemic. The loneliness epidemic is a reference to this part of this whole graph. And we think of ourselves now as we're an I society. That's why we've come to call this the I curve. So that's the data, but Shaylin, tell us what it means.
So Bob and I like to think of ourselves as a good team because he's the numbers guy and I'm the storyteller. So if you closed your eyes when he told you to a little bit before, because you weren't that into the data, I'm with you, but now's the part where you get to open your eyes. So let's talk a little bit about what this means. Bob's a humble guy, and he discovered this confluence of trends, which I just have to say, again, I'm not a numbers person, but even I can tell you how rare it is for this many measures, measuring this many disparate aspects of our society, to track the same trajectory over this long a period of time. The correlation didn't just span a year, it didn't just span a decade, it spanned 125 years. And so what that means is that it passes something Bob likes to call the interocular trauma test. It hits you between the eyes that there's something going on here, right? So what is going on here? You know, we're not the first commentators or scholars or writers to point out that America is in this multifaceted crisis. In fact, one of the early reviewers of our book said this is another addition to the How America Got Into This Mess genre of literature. Lots of people have spotted this downward trend, the fact that things have gotten worse and worse over the last half century. But rarer is those who have spotted the upward trend that preceded it. Because there's a couple of ways that you could look at this graph. You could look at this and say, you know what we need to do? We just need to turn back the clock and get to that part of our history when everything was better. We need to make America great again, right? And I want to be clear that that's actually not the message of this book. It's tempting to be nostalgic, to look back to a moment when supposedly everything was better. But there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, of course, is that that period of American history and the we that we had built toward during that moment was a very flawed we. It was a we that did not include largely people of color, to a certain extent women, and many other groups, right? And so it was the moment when we came closest to realizing this aspect of the American project, but in a very flawed way. The other problem with looking at this graph sort of nostalgically is that it's not very helpful when you're in the middle of a crisis to look at another moment when it wasn't a crisis and say, oh, we really should do that. In fact, we feel that if there was a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's not the moment when we had everything figured out. It's the moment that most looks like the moment we're living through today. And that, I think, is one of the most breathtaking findings of this data, is that we have been in a mess just as difficult, just as multifaceted as the one that we're in today. We've been there once before, but we got out of it. We fixed it. We righted the ship and got things moving in the right direction again. So if ever there were a moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's not the moment at the top of the curve, it's the moment at the bottom of the curve when Americans figured out how to turn it around. Because one of the ways in which America was so similar back then during the Gilded Age to today is there were all these doomsday prophecies about the end of democracy. The American experiment had failed. Tyranny, oligarchy, plutocracy, all is lost. Does that sound familiar? We hear a lot of that in media and in commentary today. But the thing that's so fascinating about the last Gilded Age is that none of those doomsday prophecies were fulfilled. On the contrary, and in quite an unexpected way, we entered this multifaceted, multi-decade upswing in which all of those negative trends started moving in the right direction again. And at some point, that reversed. But what we want to know is, what can we learn from the time when we got up and out of this and into an upswing? How can we recreate that upswing today? So I want to spend the remainder of our time together just looking at a few of the lessons from this period. So if we can go to the next slide. What we want to talk about was, what did this moment look like when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era? That is the moment on the heels of the Gilded Age that historians refer to as the Progressive Era, the moment when this shift began to happen. And I want to pause just briefly and make sure that we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say progressive. We hear that term a lot today, and generally today we're hearing it referred to as what I call small p progressivism. That is progressivism referring to the leftmost end of the political spectrum, right? When we talk about the progressive era, historically speaking, we are not talking about that type of small p progressivism. We're talking about what I call maybe capital P progressivism, which is not a political ideology. It's a movement that happened in American history. In fact, historians have called this movement so diverse as to be barely coherent. It was a movement that consisted of Republicans and Democrats and housewives and industrialists and immigrants and blacks and whites and all sorts of people who came together. They didn't agree on everything. A lot of times they were fighting about what they were trying to do together, But they were all united by this galvanizing belief that something had to change and that individual citizens had the power to change it. That's the progressivism and the progressive era that we're referring to, okay? So what was it about this progressive era that was so magical? Well, if we go back to the fact that this is primarily a statistical story, the backbone of this story is the data, and we have all these trends that are moving in the same direction at roughly the same time. When you have those kind of confluence of trends, one question you might ask is, well, which one of the trends turned upward first? If we can figure out what statisticians call a leading variable, then we might have some clue as to what we should focus on today if we want to create another upswing. If we focused on which thing, what might pull the rest of these trends upward? Does the data tell us anything about that? Well, we have a bit of a bias in America. You might have noticed that we tend to think that economics drives everything, which comes a little bit out of the social sciences. A lot of times social scientists treat individuals as economic actors, and the rest is just details, right? And so you might think, looking at these graphs, well, certainly it was the economic inequality that started to fix itself first, because that's usually the front end of the story. And what's so fascinating about this data is that it turns out to be really crystal clear that that's not true. In fact, the movement toward economic equality was a lagging variable. It was the last thing to change, which is really interesting because a lot of times we hear debates today which say if we could just get the economic inequality fixed, then we would all feel like we're in this together and our problems would be solved. And that turns out not to have been how it worked last time. Now don't mishear me. I'm not saying it's not important to focus on fixing economic inequality. That is an urgent and pressing issue in this country. But what we learn from this data is actually that maybe there's something underneath that that we have to get right first. So if we know that economics was a lagging indicator, well, do we know what the leading indicator was? This is a little bit hard to say because we're dealing with, as Bob indicated, so many different data points. And from a sort of statistical perspective, we're looking really far back in time, 125 years ago. And so sometimes we like to compare it to being on the ground, looking up at a flock of birds in flight. And there's lots and lots of birds up there, and they're all moving in the same direction, and you're 1,000 feet down, and then all of a sudden you see them shift, and there's a turning point. They move in a different direction. And you think to yourself, which of those birds led the way? It's really hard to tell from that far away. And that's a little bit what we're dealing with here with this kind of a data, this sort of huge data sets that we're dealing with here. But what we can see when we pair the data we have with the historical record is that it begins to be really clear that the first thing that changed during the last upswing was a moral and cultural shift. Before we started changing our economics, before we started changing our politics, we started to question the cultural and moral underpinnings of our society. Now, what did America look like culturally during this Gilded Age? Not too long before the kind of 1880s, 1890s period, a guy named Charles Darwin came onto the scene and articulated the survival of the fittest. And this was a theory that spoke specifically to how the biological world works. But there were people who said, well, if that's how the natural world works, that's how society should work. We'll just structure it as one giant competition, and only the strong will survive, and the devil take the hindmost. And that was called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin himself did not subscribe to this particular belief, but in his name, it became this cultural milieu that characterized the Gilded Age. It was a very eye-focused, up or down, together. Whether we believe it or not, whether we want to do it or not, when we come together, we go up together. We're all better off when we're all better off. And now we have the data to prove it. We've been in a mess just like the one we're in today. The history shows us that there's hope of getting out of it, but we have to start today. We have to start in places that might be less familiar to us. Places of the heart, places of connection, to rebuild that social fabric and that sense of cohesion that's going to bring us back to where we. Thank you.
is a somewhat religious setting, so I'm going to quote actually from one of the greatest religious leaders of the 21st century. Sadly, he died prematurely. His name is Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks was the chief rabbi of London. He was also one of the world's greatest moral philosophers, and to my great pleasure, he and I became personal friends. And actually, just 2 or 3 days ago, I took part in a very long memorial service for him that was actually held in Tel Aviv. So I was on Zoom, and Sacks is if you don't know the name S-A-C-K-S, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, it ought to be required reading in any moral course. He's deeply, deeply religious, but he's Orthodox, right? So but on the other hand, he's also deeply human. That's the most amazing thing about him. Okay. Jonathan Sacks distinguished between hope and optimism. And I'm now just repeating what he said. Optimism, he said, is a passive virtue. He's a religious guy, right? So he uses words like virtue. A passive virtue. If you're optimistic, it's you're standing back and you're looking and you're seeing trends going up or trends going down. But hope, he said, is an active virtue. Hope is saying, I can see how things could go in the right direction, and I'm going to do my darndest to make them go in that direction. You see the difference between whether you agree with Jonathan Sacks' theology or not? It's a very useful distinction. And it's useful to us because I think both of us, we don't know whether we're going to be optimistic or not. I mean, it's really hard to predict the future. As Yogi Berra said, it's especially hard to predict the future. But we're hopeful. Because now you should see what I mean by that. We could see how it could go in the right direction. And we want to, both of us, actually, I'm trying to change America. Not just to observe it. I hope you see that. And I'm not ashamed of that at all. Even though I'm an academic social scientist and I count things and so on, I want to change America. Of course, who wouldn't want to change America? And that makes me hopeful. Whether or not I'm optimistic. Does that make sense?
And I think the people in this audience, the students in this audience, are uniquely equipped to lead America into a more hopeful space. We love sharing this message at Christian colleges and universities because you already have the language. You already have the concepts that we need infused back into our society, back into our conversations about policy, right? What is the moral framework under which this nation, this society is operating? We need articulate, not just social entrepreneurs, not just political entrepreneurs, not just economic entrepreneurs. We need moral entrepreneurs who are willing to take that voice and infuse it into the public square in unique and innovative ways. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. That's a tough one, right? In a very secular moment in American history, for people who have a deep sense of virtue and a deep sense of right and wrong to come in and say, hey, we have something to add to this conversation and we're not going to be shy about it. That's what happened last time. I'm not just saying this because I'm trying to stroke your egos here, right? That's actually what the historical record says changed America the last time. So that's one thing that you can do is find your voice. Figure out how what you know in your heart and in your own spiritual life, how can you translate that into the public sphere? And the other thing that I will just say is go and talk to your neighbor. I'm a little bit preaching to the choir here because on measures of social capital, Utah is off the charts, right? But people come to us all the time and say, how do we fix disinformation? How do we fix all these big problems, political polarization? And I say, do you know your neighbor's name? When was the last time that you asked them about something important? A way that you could get to know them? And people say, I don't know, right? The solution to these big problems is surprisingly granular. So you need to not get overwhelmed by how big the problems are and just start right where you are. One conversation across a line of difference tomorrow. Religious difference, political difference, demographic difference. Maybe you have a conversation with your grandmother, right, to get her perspective. Start there and grow from there because that's the only way that we're going to reweave our social fabric.